The church bells tolled softly as Eleanor Whitmore, 72 years old with silver hair pinned neatly into a bun, walked slowly down the aisle. Her black dress hung loosely on her frail frame, and her gloved hands trembled as they clutched a small bouquet of white lilies. At the front, Richard's coffin rested beneath a spray of roses, the scent of them heavy in the air. She lowered herself into the front pew, her knees aching from the motion, and waited for some word of comfort, some gesture of kindness from the family she had once nurtured. Instead, she felt only eyes on her, sharp, cold, and distant. Whispers drifted through the air behind her, hushed yet cutting. Her son Michael sat stiffly across the aisle, avoiding her gaze, while his wife Clarissa leaned in close to murmur something that made him smirk faintly. No one reached out to take Eleanor's hand. No one leaned toward her with words of sympathy. The warmth of shared grief was absent. In its place was a chilling silence broken only by the rustle of expensive suits and the clicking of heels on polished stone. The family she had devoted her life to looked at her not as a grieving widow but as an obstacle, an old woman taking up space in a narrative they wished to rewrite. As the priest began to speak of Richard's legacy, Eleanor's heart ached. She had stood beside her husband for decades, but in that moment she sat utterly alone, surrounded not by love but by judgment. The silence pressed in on her, heavier than the tolling of the bells, and Eleanor realized with painful clarity that the funeral was not just for Richard, it was also the quiet burial of her place within her own family. The house that had once been Eleanor Whitmore's sanctuary echoed with the sound of hurried footsteps and careless laughter. The scent of funeral lilies still clung faintly to the air, yet already her relatives swarmed through the rooms like scavengers circling a carcass. Neon-colored stickers in garish shades of green, pink, and orange were slapped onto furniture, paintings, and heirlooms with the thoughtless efficiency of shoppers at an estate sale. Her grandson strutted through the parlor, peeling stickers from a roll and pressing them onto anything that caught his eye. The grandfather clock Richard had once polished by hand, the leather armchair where Eleanor had nursed her husband during long winter nights, even the cabinet filled with delicate wedding china. "This one's mine," he announced proudly, as though claiming prizes at a carnival. In the dining room, her granddaughter held up a phone with an app open, scanning the walls and measuring the space. "We'll remodel this whole area once she's out," she declared. "Spa room, maybe a wine-tasting nook." Her words hung in the air, callous and unapologetic, as if Eleanor were already gone. From the kitchen doorway, Clarissa appeared with a tray of champagne flutes, her smile bright and celebratory. "We're honoring Richard's legacy tonight," she announced, handing out glasses as if this were a party instead of a mourning. Someone muttered a crude joke about clearing out the ghosts, and the room erupted in laughter. Eleanor stood quietly in the hallway, her hands gripping the banister Richard had once smoothed with care. She watched as her life was divided up piece by piece, the memories of decades reduced to property tags and casual banter. No one looked at her. No one asked what she wanted. To them, she was invisible, a shadow in the house she had built, watching strangers, her own blood, pick apart her world like vultures feasting on what remained. The clinking of glasses and bursts of laughter filled the dining room, a cruel soundtrack to what should have been a solemn evening. Eleanor lingered at the edge of the table, her eyes drawn to the seat where she had once sat beside Richard for decades of meals, now occupied by her son's wife. In its place for her stood a flimsy folding chair dragged in from the garage, one leg unsteady, its metal frame cold against her hand. "Here, Mother. You'll be more comfortable away from the noise," Clarissa said with a saccharine smile, guiding Eleanor toward the mudroom. The words carried no kindness, only dismissal. The mudroom smelled faintly of bleach and damp wood. A mop bucket sat in one corner, a broken broom in another. They placed a paper plate in her lap, dried chicken and overcooked potatoes balanced on flimsy cardboard, already going cold. Her drink was not champagne but a lukewarm cup of tap water in a plastic cup. Through the thin walls she could hear them, voices raised in cheer, plans for remodeling the house, jokes about mothballs and death. Every word was a reminder that she was no longer part of the family's story, only a burden tucked away in the shadows. Eleanor sat in silence, her frail hands holding the plate steady so it would not betray her trembling. The folding chair wobbled beneath her, yet she held herself upright with dignity. They thought they had hidden her away, that she would fade quietly into the background. But as she swallowed the chalky taste of cold chicken, her resolve hardened. They could strip her of comfort, of place, even of acknowledgement, but not of the truth she still carried deep within her. The voices carried easily from the dining room into the narrow mudroom, each word sharper than the sound of silverware against porcelain. Eleanor sat quietly, her back pressed against the peeling wall, her paper plate untouched on her lap. She had learned over the years that silence could be armor, but tonight, silence felt like erasure. "They say Dad built an empire," one of the younger cousins remarked with a laugh. "She built soup." The words were followed by a ripple of amusement, cruel and careless. "She should be grateful she even has a roof over her head," another chimed in. "Without him, she'd have been nothing." "Maybe we should just give her the garden shed," her grandson added with a grin. "It's big enough for her knitting and pension checks." The room erupted in laughter, their voices mingling with the clinking of champagne glasses. Eleanor's grip tightened around her cup, her knuckles pale against the thin plastic. They didn't know. They had never asked. They had no idea of the nights she spent bent over ledgers, the heirlooms she sold in secret, the proposals she drafted by hand when Richard was too weary to think. Every sacrifice she made was invisible because she had been told it was better that way, that a woman's strength lived in shadows. Now they used her silence as proof she had done nothing. They dismissed her life's work with a joke, reducing decades of endurance and sacrifice to a single, cruel line. "She built soup." Eleanor's eyes burned, but no tears fell. Instead, a quiet fire stirred inside her chest. They had erased her from the story, but she still remembered every page they tried to tear away. Alone in the dim mudroom, Eleanor slipped her hand into the pocket of her cardigan, her fingers brushing against the worn edges of an envelope she had carried for years. The paper was creased and yellowed with time, but it was more than paper. It was her lifeline, her unspoken proof, the hidden chapter of a story no one believed she had written. Inside lay the trust papers, signed and notarized nearly 15 years earlier, declaring her as co-founder and early investor in Richard's company. No one in the family knew of their existence. They had never asked how the business survived its darkest days, never wondered where the sudden surge of capital had come from. They assumed Richard had carried the weight alone, and she had let them believe it. Her thumb traced the inked letters of her own name, written in a shade of blue that the lawyer insisted would stand out in court. Richard had agreed at the time, reluctant but grateful, promising her the acknowledgement she never received. Instead, he had buried the truth as carefully as she had hidden this envelope. The voices outside grew louder. Laughter, plans, the sound of glasses being filled again. Eleanor clutched the papers tighter, pressing them against her chest beneath the folds of her sweater. They thought she was invisible, powerless, irrelevant. But within this fragile envelope lay the key to everything they claimed as their own. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing slowly, feeling the quiet strength settle over her. Let them laugh. Let them divide. Let them erase. One day soon, the document in her hands would speak louder than all their mockery, and the truth she had protected in silence would finally matter. The mudroom's silence gave way to memory, pulling Eleanor back to a night long ago when the house had still been filled with warmth instead of contempt. Richard had returned late, his shoulders heavy, his tie loosened, and the despair in his eyes sharper than words. The company was collapsing, the bank circling like a predator, and bankruptcy loomed like a storm cloud ready to break. "We just need one more deal," he had whispered, staring into the cold fireplace. "If I can secure it, we'll survive. But I have nothing left to offer them. No collateral, no leverage." Eleanor had nodded, her face calm though her heart raced. That night, when Richard finally surrendered to restless sleep, she opened the velvet box hidden in the back of her drawer. Inside lay the treasures of a lifetime, her mother's emerald necklace, the gold bangles given on her wedding day, the diamond earrings Richard had fastened to her ears on their first anniversary. Each piece carried memory, love, and history, but in that moment, they were transformed into something more. At dawn, she walked quietly through the streets, her coat pulled tight against the morning chill, until she reached the jeweler's shop. With steady hands, she laid the heirlooms on the counter, one by one, ignoring the sting in her chest as the appraiser examined them like ordinary trinkets. Hours later, the funds were wired directly into the company's account, anonymous, untraceable, life-saving. Richard never asked where the money came from. He never wanted to know. The company survived, and the world praised him as a visionary. Eleanor stayed silent, her sacrifice folded neatly into the shadows, unseen by all but her own memory. And as the laughter of her family echoed faintly from the dining room, Eleanor touched her sweater pocket where the trust papers rested and thought, "They will learn one day. They will finally know what it cost me to keep this family alive." The memory returned with the weight of ink-stained fingers and sleepless nights. Richard had been pacing the study, his glass of scotch untouched, his face drawn with worry. The board had rejected draft after draft of his proposals, and the investors were slipping away. "I don't know what else to give them," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "They'll never believe in me." He collapsed into a chair, exhausted, and by midnight had drifted into a heavy sleep. Eleanor sat alone at the kitchen table, the lamp casting a pale circle of light across a stack of blank paper. She wrapped her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, poured herself a cup of chamomile tea, and began to write. Her mind moved quickly, sharper than she remembered, drawing on skills long hidden beneath years of domestic quiet. She mapped out a strategy of expansion, identified emerging markets, and outlined a scalable growth model tied to supply chain reform. She worked until dawn, the scratch of her pen steady, her breath calm despite the enormity of what she was creating. When she finished, she signed it not with her own name but with a harmless pseudonym, L. Brightwood. She knew the truth. The board would never take a woman seriously, not in that world. But under a different name, her ideas might live. 2 days later, Richard returned home with a spark in his eyes. "Someone sent me a proposal," he said, waving the pages. "Anonymous. Brilliant. Even the handwriting looks familiar." Eleanor only smiled faintly, and I kept stirring the soup on the stove. That anonymous proposal became the cornerstone of the company's IPO, bringing in tens of millions and saving the empire they all now worshipped. The world celebrated Richard as a genius, a man of vision. No one ever knew that the true visionary had been sitting quietly in the kitchen, her brilliance hidden behind an apron, her name erased before it was ever spoken. It was only 5 days after Richard's funeral when the decision was made. Eleanor returned from a short walk in the garden to find her bedroom stripped bare. The drawers had been emptied, her silk scarves crammed into cardboard boxes labeled donation, her perfume bottles rattling against one another as if they were nothing more than clutter. Laughter echoed upstairs as suitcases rolled across the floorboards, her family already settling into spaces that once belonged to her. "We've decided it's best," Clarissa announced smoothly, clipboard in hand, her tone sharp with false kindness. "You'll be more comfortable downstairs." Eleanor blinked, confused. "Downstairs." "The laundry room," Clarissa clarified, her smile polished like glass. "It's technically a utility space, but there's room for a cot. It's only temporary." And with that, the matter was settled. No one asked Eleanor what she wanted. No one questioned whether the arrangement was cruel. They simply directed her down the narrow steps, past the scent of mildew and bleach, into a cramped room where a rusted utility sink leaned against the wall and a plastic mop bucket sat in the corner. A cot had been shoved beneath a flickering bulb, covered with nothing more than an old moving blanket. Beside it sat a dented thermos and a cracked picture frame containing the only relic of her past the family hadn't already claimed. The air was cold, and every hum of the bulb above her seemed to echo the truth. She was no longer a mother, a wife, or a matriarch in their eyes. She was an inconvenience to be hidden away like laundry. Eleanor sat on the cot, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The walls pressed in around her, but she refused to bend beneath the weight of their contempt. They thought they had exiled her, silenced her, erased her. But she knew something they did not, that the laundry room was only a waiting place, and she was far from finished. The house had grown strangely quiet that evening, the echoes of laughter fading into distant murmurs. Eleanor moved carefully through the kitchen, her steps slow, her body weary from the endless small humiliations. She reached for a glass of water, opening the fridge door, when something caught her eye, a faint glint wedged between the appliance and the wall. Bending down, she pulled it free, a picture frame, its glass cracked at the corner, dust clinging to its edges. When she turned it over, her breath caught. It was their 30th anniversary photo. Richard stood tall, his arm wrapped firmly around her shoulders, both of them smiling beneath the rose arbor he had planted for her. She remembered the day vividly. The warm June breeze, the scent of blossoms, the pride of having endured decades side by side. Now the frame bore scratches, the photo bent, as if it had been shoved aside without care. Someone had ripped it from the hallway wall and tossed it behind the refrigerator like forgotten junk. A life, a marriage, 30 years of devotion, discarded as though it meant nothing. Eleanor's hands trembled as she wiped the dust from Richard's face. She pressed the photo against her chest, holding it tightly as if by clutching it close she could preserve what little remained of the life they had shared. Her eyes stung, not from weakness, but from the cold truth settling in. Her family did not value her memories, only her absence. Yet as she stood there, the cracked frame against her heart, Eleanor felt something shift within her. They could throw away the photographs, bury the tokens of her life, strip the house of every sign she had existed, but they could not erase what she remembered. And memory, she realized, was stronger than their cruelty. It was hers, and it would endure. The morning air was cool as Eleanor wrapped her beige coat tightly around her frail frame and walked the 2 blocks to the old brick office building on Main Street. Her son had cut off her cell phone service, but she had not forgotten the number written in careful script on a faded piece of stationery tucked inside her purse. The pay phone outside the pharmacy had been enough to arrange the meeting. "It's time," she had whispered, and Mr. Alden had understood. The lawyer's office smelled faintly of leather and old paper, a scent Eleanor found oddly comforting. Mr. Alden, a tall man with silver hair and kind but shrewd eyes, rose from behind his mahogany desk as she entered. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said softly, "I was wondering when you'd come." With hands that shook only slightly, Eleanor set a worn leather folder on the polished wood. Its edges were frayed, its brass clasp tarnished, but inside it contained the truth of her life. She opened it carefully, 1 page at a time, laying out the documents like a hand of cards played with deliberate precision. First came the trust certificate, her name printed boldly beside Richard's, not as a witness, not as a dependent, but as co-founder. Then the bank memorandum, proof of the deposit she had made from selling her heirloom jewelry, money that had rescued the company from collapse. And finally, a bundle of handwritten pages, yellowed by time, the original draft of the IPO proposal, signed only with her pseudonym. Mr. Alden studied each document in silence, his brows knitting, his eyes narrowing with recognition. When he finally looked up, there was a quiet weight in his voice. "You've been holding on to this for years." Eleanor nodded. "Not for revenge," she whispered. "For truth." For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to breathe deeply. In this quiet office, she was no longer invisible. The folder on the desk carried her name, her mind, her sacrifice, and soon, the world would know it. The afternoon sun filtered weakly through the blinds of Mr. Alden's office, striping the desk in pale light. Eleanor sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, the worn leather folder resting between them like a fragile secret finally set free. Across from her, Mr. Alden cleared his throat as another man entered the room, a handwriting specialist from Stanford, his briefcase brimming with tools and magnifiers. "Mrs. Whitmore," the expert said politely, sliding on a pair of spectacles. "Shall we begin?" Eleanor nodded, her silver hair gleaming softly in the light. Her heart pounded, though her face remained calm. The analyst spread the handwritten pages of the IPO proposal across the desk, the ink slightly smudged from restless nights long ago. Beside them, he placed samples Eleanor had written only moments earlier. Loops of cursive, her steady signature, and a few dictated lines. With careful precision, he studied the strokes, the pressure of the pen, the tilt of the letters, the slight hesitation in certain curves. Time passed slowly, the only sound the scratch of his pen as he made notes on his chart. Eleanor sat still, though inside her memories swirled. Nights spent scribbling by lamplight, her mind racing while Richard slept, her words hidden behind a false name. At last, the expert set his pen down. "It's a perfect match," he said with quiet certainty. "Every loop, every pause, every stroke aligns. The author of this proposal," he tapped the yellowed pages, "is you." For a moment, Eleanor could not speak. Mr. Alden leaned back in his chair, his expression firm but satisfied. "That settles it," he said. "Your legacy is no longer theirs to erase." Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not as a widow, not as a burden, but as the mind behind the empire. The truth, long buried, had finally been restored to her name. The law office was a cold, modern space. Glass walls, leather chairs, the faint smell of polished steel. Eleanor sat at the far end of the table on a folding chair someone had dragged in, as though she were an afterthought. Her son Michael lounged near the front, his polished shoes crossed confidently, while Clarissa whispered something that made him chuckle. Around them, the younger relatives busied themselves with phones and idle chatter, their eyes never once meeting hers. "She'll be gone by Christmas," Michael muttered under his breath, lifting a complimentary espresso cup to his lips. His words carried easily enough for Eleanor to hear, and the sting of them tightened her chest. Laughter followed from the corner where her granddaughter smirked, thumbs flying across her phone. Eleanor lowered her gaze, her hands resting gently on her lap. She had expected cruelty, but the casual way they dismissed her, as if she were already buried, cut deeper than open hostility. When Mr. Alden entered, briefcase in hand, the room shifted. The air grew still, the noise subdued by the gravity he carried. He greeted them curtly, then placed the briefcase on the table and withdrew a small silver recorder. "This," he said, pressing a button, "is the voice of Richard Whitmore, recorded shortly before his passing." A hush fell over the room as Richard's voice filled the air. Slower than Eleanor remembered, but steady. "If my son ever speaks ill of his mother," the voice declared, "deduct $1 million from his inheritance for every word." The room froze. Michael's face drained of color, his smirk vanishing as though wiped away. A pen slipped from his hand and clattered onto the table. Mr. Alden's voice cut through the silence. "The statements have been tallied and documented. Every insult, every cruel remark. By Mr. Whitmore's command, the deductions are significant." Eleanor raised her head for the first time, her eyes calm but unwavering. The mocking voices that had trailed her for weeks had finally been silenced, replaced by the weight of Richard's final words. For once, it was not her silence that filled the room. It was theirs. The silence in the law office grew heavier as Mr. Alden opened a folder thick with transcripts. He adjusted his glasses and began to read aloud, his tone precise, deliberate. "Exhibit A," he announced, "verified home security transcripts, taken 3 days after the funeral." His fingers slid down the page. 1. She's still breathing? 2. Thought she'd be gone by now. 3. Check her pulse at the will reading. 4. She built soup, he built an empire. Each phrase struck the air like a gavel. Eleanor sat perfectly still, her silver hair catching the cold light as the words of her own children were laid bare. Mr. Alden turned the page. Total recorded insults, 88. At $1 million per remark, as instructed by Mr. Whitmore, the total deduction is $88 million. A gasp rippled through the room. Michael shot forward in his chair, his face mottled red, his voice breaking. "This is absurd. You can't do this." He couldn't. But Mr. Alden held up a hand, unshaken. "He did. The will is clear. Every word spoken against your mother carries a price. And that price has been paid. Clarissa's polished composure faltered. She gripped Michael's arm as though to steady him, but her own eyes were wide with panic. Across the table, the grandchildren sat in stunned silence, their earlier bravado stripped away. Eleanor's lips curved into the faintest smile, not of triumph, but of quiet justice. The cruelty they had tossed so carelessly into the air had finally returned, weighted and counted. For every word that had chipped away at her dignity, Richard had carved a debt in stone. In that moment, Eleanor felt no need to speak. The deductions themselves were her voice, her vindication, echoing louder than all the years of silence. The room remained tense, the air thick with disbelief, when Mr. Alden closed the transcript folder and reached again into his briefcase. From within, he drew out a second stack of documents, sleek, heavy with seals, bound with authority. "Now," he said, his voice calm, "as for the matter of the estate and intellectual property." He slid the folder across the polished table toward Eleanor. "By Mr. Richard Whitmore's final will and testament, the primary beneficiary of all holdings, copyrights, and estate assets is his wife, Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore." The words landed like thunder. Chairs creaked as relatives shifted in shock. Michael's mouth opened, but no sound came. Clarissa's face drained of color, her fingers fumbling for her phone as if a lawyer's number could undo the truth written in black and white. Mr. Alden continued, without pause. "This includes full ownership of the Whitmore estate, portfolio transfers, and, most notably, the intellectual property tied to the company's IPO model, filed and verified as originating from her hand." He tapped a certificate, stamped and notarized, with Eleanor's pseudonym crossed to reveal her true name. Gasps filled the room. Catherine, her granddaughter, dropped her phone with a sharp clatter onto the table. "All this time," she whispered, "it was hers." Michael finally found his voice, but it cracked under the weight of fury and disbelief. "She made soup. She mended socks. She—" "Yes," Mr. Alden interrupted smoothly, allowing the faintest smile, "and she also saved your father's empire. Without her, there would be no inheritance to fight over." Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the folder. The weight of it pressed into her palms. Deeds, patents, rights, all the proof of what she had built in silence. For decades, her sacrifices had been dismissed, her brilliance hidden. Now, with the world forced to acknowledge her truth, Eleanor lifted her head, silver hair gleaming in the sterile light. For the first time, her name stood where it always belonged, at the heart of the legacy they thought was theirs alone. The law office had emptied, leaving behind only echoes of disbelief and the shuffle of papers being packed away. Eleanor stood slowly, clutching the folder that bore her name and her legacy. She turned toward the door, ready to leave the sterile room and the stairs that had once pierced her like knives. But then Michael's voice broke the silence. "Mother, wait."
She paused.
Her son, once so confident and cruel, now stood trembling, his shoulders slumped as though the weight of his choices had finally settled upon him. His eyes, red-rimmed with anger and something close to desperation, searched hers. "I didn't know," he said hoarsely, his voice cracking. "I didn't know it was you all along. I didn't know how much you gave." He faltered, then stepped forward, his hand outstretched like a child again. "Please forgive me." For a moment, Eleanor saw him as he had once been, the little boy who clutched her hand during storms, who cried on her shoulder when the world first told him no. A flicker of tenderness stirred, but it was quickly overtaken by the memory of his words, sharp and merciless. "She's still breathing?" Thought she'd be gone by now. Her spine straightened. The folder pressed firm against her chest, not just paper, but proof of survival, of strength. She met his gaze with steady eyes, her silver hair glowing in the thin light of the room. "No, Michael," she said quietly, her voice unshaken. "I cannot forgive what you chose to erase." His face crumpled, his hand falling uselessly to his side. Around them, the silence grew heavy once more, but this time it was not Eleanor who was diminished by it. It was her son. She turned and walked toward the door, each step deliberate, her dignity intact. Behind her, Michael's broken whisper followed like a shadow. "I'm sorry." But Eleanor did not look back. Some wounds, she knew, were too deep for apology. The house was silent at last. The greedy voices that once echoed through its halls had vanished, leaving only the soft creak of floorboards under Eleanor's steady steps. She moved slowly but with purpose, her silver hair glinting beneath the afternoon light that filtered through lace curtains. In the parlor, her eyes fell on the grandfather clock Richard had once polished by hand. A neon green sticker clung to its wooden frame, the words "This One's Mine" scrawled across it in bold ink. Eleanor's fingers reached out, peeling the paper away with deliberate care. She folded it neatly, then dropped it into the trash. Room by room, she continued. In the dining room, she plucked a pink sticker from the antique sideboard where her wedding china had rested. In the hallway, a yellow tag clung stubbornly to the leather armchair where Richard had read to their son. Upstairs, a bright orange slip marred the silver frame of their wedding photo. One by one, Eleanor removed them all. Each rip of paper was like reclaiming a piece of herself that had been mocked, stolen, or dismissed. The stickers had been declarations of conquest, arrogant claims from children who thought kindness was consent. But now, as Eleanor peeled them away, the house seemed to breathe again, less suffocated, less haunted by greed. She paused by the grand piano, her hand brushing the polished lid. A sticker clung there too, but she did not throw it away. Instead, she closed the piano gently, whispering, "This one was always his, and he gave it to no one." By the time she finished, the trash bin was filled with crumpled neon slips, their colors dull against the weight of her reclamation. The rooms no longer felt like battlefields. They felt like hers again, if only for a little while. Eleanor stood in the center of the hallway, breathing in the quiet. The house was no longer a place of erasure. It was proof that she had endured and that she had taken back what was always hers. Spring sunlight streamed through the wide windows of Eleanor's new penthouse, the steady rhythm of ocean waves whispering beyond the balcony. The sea air was crisp, carrying none of the suffocating heaviness of the old house. Here, there were no neon stickers, no mocking laughter. Only space, light, and peace. Her days began with the hush of waves and ended with the glow of sunsets, painting the horizon in gold and crimson. The rooms were simple, uncluttered. Just a few cherished belongings, her favorite books, and a framed anniversary photo she had carefully restored. On the fridge hung a faded crayon drawing from her youngest grandson, years before contempt had replaced innocence. In purple scribble it read, "To Grandma, you think better than Google." But Eleanor had not come here merely to rest. At her desk, she worked quietly on papers that mattered far more than her past. With the royalties from the patent still flowing steadily, she established a foundation, the Whitmore Fund for Women Who Were Erased. It wasn't flashy, no galas or red carpet events. Just scholarships, grants, and recognition for women whose voices had been silenced, whose ideas had been hidden behind others' names. Each application she approved felt like a small victory, each letter of thanks a reminder that her own suffering had been transformed into something enduring and powerful. She had once been buried in assumptions, dismissed as invisible, but now she was offering light to others still trapped in the shadows. One evening, she stepped onto her balcony, her silver hair loose in the sea breeze. The horizon stretched wide before her, endless and alive. Eleanor smiled, not with bitterness, but with quiet triumph. Her story had been rewritten. She was no longer the forgotten widow in the laundry room. She was Eleanor Whitmore, visionary, survivor, builder, and her new beginning had only just begun. Thank you for watching Eleanor's story of strength and resilience. If her journey moved you, don't forget to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe for more powerful true stories. Your support helps us keep these voices alive.